do it? Sure. So again, we'll see if I get it right this time. But this is at least Anne Temkin. There's no doubt about that. And I thought first maybe, I mean, sometimes we take things for granted. I'd like to see how many of you have actually been to MoMA in New York? So sort of 1/3 to half of you roughly. I think that there might be a point to sort of show some images of what, I mean, the typical visitor to MoMA would see and would come for, I guess. Is that a starting point? Just a few slides.
Certainly.
Yeah. Maybe we can have lights out here.
Yeah, that's a good idea. You try.
I try. Doesn't want to dance.
So one of the things we were talking about yesterday at M+, was the fact that unlike M+, which in a way has the great advantage of starting from a blank page as they embark on their collecting, what all of the three of us here tonight, of course, are working from at the present moment is a history of the collection that museum has already. And in our case at MoMA, what we have is really truly an embarrassment of riches of works that are favorites and icons in modern art history that we feel true, genuine love for ourselves, and that also we realize our visitors absolutely expect to see when they come. So when we think about changing and adapting in the 21st century, we're also keeping in mind, really in the front of our mind, that we have a responsibility to, and we've just picked 5 or 6 to give you this idea, Van Gogh's Starry Night, Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, Matisse's Dance, Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie, Jackson Pollock's One, and Jasper Johns' Flag. And these few paintings are standing for really many more paintings and sculptures that have become almost synonymous with our own identity in people's minds.
Yeah. In this context, since we had a discussion, internal discussion yesterday in a workshop, and you told me something that I found totally amazing, and that was that 2/3 of your visitors are once-in-a-lifetime visitors, people who come there, they travel from far away, and they go and they come to MoMA to see the museum and see the collection. And of course, they come with exactly these expectations. And my immediate thought was, of course, that, I mean, that's fantastic in a certain way. Yeah. And that you are this magnet, but at the same time, it must be such a challenge for you in terms of what you can do, because I can see that there is a gap between what you and your curatorial team, what you want to show and what you, and then the expectations of the audience that comes in.
Yes. And if we wanted to, it would not be hard to almost sit back and do nothing and have these things on the wall and still have people come. So there's one more, even if we want to flip one more slide. This I can just tell the story that here's a work which has only been in the collection 20 years. It's not even one that has a 50-year history of being there to see at MoMA. But already, if there is a day that this is not on view for some reason, we get absolutely bombarded with complaints from the visitors. So it's not something that we don't know about. We hear very directly, immediately from our public what is going on if the things they want to see are not there. And what we have to figure out is how to combine pleasing that desire, which we absolutely respect and honor, with for our own artistic interests as curators, for the artistic interest of a whole set of different audiences who know us very well and whom we care about very deeply. And I think I would put at the top of that list artists, art historians, scholars, other curators, art collectors, art writers, just art fans who are depending on MoMA, or we like to think they're depending on MoMA, to lead them to new thinking, either about older works of art or about works of art they've never seen before. And we take that job absolutely as seriously, or even, I must say, we think about it day and night in relation to what we also do that people, in a sense, expect us to do. We want to also surprise people. That's the challenge we give ourselves.
Do you do that by sort of giving them new friends and putting them in new contexts and rearranging the stories that they can tell and putting them in new stories, or what are the alternatives you work with?
Certainly one way is to rearrange or do unexpected things in the galleries by the way that you simply arrange and present the works. But there's also, I think, something to be said for just doing more things in more galleries, aside from certain galleries which stay fairly classic. So, for example, something that we didn't have a shot of here, but we have a room with a set of paintings by Monet of his water lilies. You know, and I don't feel a need to change that. People go there, they love it. We haven't even done that much experimenting with the room with Starry Night. You know, yes, on certain occasions we could think of all different kinds of ways to juxtapose the Starry Night with contemporary art or different things than it usually the way you encounter it at MoMA echoes the way it was first shown at MoMA, which was in our very, very first special exhibition in 1929, when we did a show of 4 artists, and they were Van Gogh, Gauguin, Seurat, and Cézanne. And from that first show, we've taken these as the sort of 4 fathers of modern art's collection at MoMA and leave it pretty much that way. But then you want to go from that gallery into a gallery full of things you haven't seen, or you want to go down a floor and see a gallery that's completely different from what you saw the last time you were at MoMA.
One of the things I also learned yesterday was that what you know about your visitors' way of moving in the building is that they don't walk necessarily chronologically. They may walk into one floor, and that's probably the earliest part of the story, but then they can move and bypass a big section and go into something that is contemporary. And of course, in the contemporary field, I can imagine that you also can act much more freely because you don't have the same set of expectations there.
That's right. And I think what we feel and what's very different today as opposed to how my predecessors worked 20 or 40 years ago is I think the number one difference is that what we're trying to do in, let's call it a total of 50 galleries, 50 individual rooms, is tell you 50 good stories that hang together, each as their own story. And I think our predecessors in previous decades had the idea that if you went from A to Z through our galleries, you would get the story of modern art. And they would be very upset, in fact, if they knew that the visitor stopped at M or P. Today, if you start at P and go to Z, or you only see Y or F, that's totally fine with us because we make sure that, at least in our opinion, each and every one of those experiences is rich. And we don't feel like we have to give you some kind of textbook experience. For that, you can read a textbook.
No, I think that's a good point. And you, even though you are expanding and you're planning yet another expansion of the building. And of course, one thing that one could dream of there is that this, because some of us actually do follow the narrative and the sort of chronological narrative, is that some of the stories that I know you have, I mean, I know the collection relatively well, that you have in sort of pockets in this story that very seldom gets seen, maybe could be seen then, so it's not only expanding towards contemporary art and giving more space for big installations. I'm thinking of, I know, is it from the 40s and 50s? There's a pocket of there was a period when you acquired really good numbers of African-American artists, for example.
Yes.
And I think more or less the same of 50s, 60s Latin American art, for example.
Yes. Yes, we have a few slides now I can show you of art from Latin America. We began collecting it in the 1930s, and we invited Diego Rivera for a show at MoMA in 1931. And Diego Rivera was like the Damien Hirst of his time. He was a complete superstar when he came to MoMA in 1931.
That's unfair to Diego Rivera, I think.
And Jose Orozco, same thing, came to MoMA himself to work on a fresco that we did in a show in 1940, going on. People in the 60s, so collected consistently from Latin America through the 40s, 50s, and through the 60s, Marisol, Botero. And from our founding, we really defined our territory as Europe and the Americas. And I think one of the big questions, if not the question, that faces us in our collecting today is a feeling that that is no longer sufficient.
Were these works shown sort of during extended periods in the collection at the time, or did they travel? Well, there were murals, but they still are collectible. So did they travel down into the basement immediately?
Not immediately. I think what happened was that in the 80s and 90s, maybe as early as the 70s, there became a kind of narrowing. The kind of narrowing that I was describing among the curators in thinking that you had to show the one path of the most important masterpieces. And during this last 20 years, we've taken a lot of these things up from storage. So there are always works from Latin America on view, for example. There are always works by African American artists on view. These are things that we think matter without necessarily being the most valuable, famous thing in the collection. They're the thing that gives the collection flavor. And I think that it's important that what the public sees, so by the way, just talking about our painting and sculpture collection, what the public sees at any one time is 5% of it. So if it's 4,000 things, we have 200 on view. I hope my arithmetic is right there. And so what we have to say is that we revolve and we rotate what's on view very often today because we want to be able to present these different flavors. And I think for us, we know, even with some sadness, that especially for the people who will be at MoMA only one time in their life, they're not getting an absolute perfect story. But the difference is today, we don't think there's so much one perfect story that we could give. And so we don't even feel like in the old days when maybe they thought they were giving one perfect story, that they really were doing that. So in fact, we're not sacrificing anything.
Have you had moments when you thought that, I mean, there are these, I mean, it's an ongoing discussion that you should broaden the scope and you have to expand not only what you're collecting, but also what you're presenting from what you already have collected. That why do that? Why is that necessary when we can only show 5%? Why add more that you can't show? Have you had those thoughts?
Well, we are masochists, so I think that we just realize that the future, well, or we dream, as you are dreaming now, except yours will be real, that we will have more space. And I think you sometimes hear about that as private, as you talking about private collectors, not museums, that the great private collector, the maniac, perhaps, private collector, is the one who doesn't buy art wondering where she's going to put it in her house or what wall she has for it. She just wants it so much that she gets it and then worry later about finding a building or a wall or a friend's house to put that thing. And I think the museum has to have a little bit of that mania, believing that if we are making the right choices, our successors will find a place to show them.
And in a way, that's what you're doing, of course, with the Diego Riveras and some of the things that are coming back on display. I mean, what's the thinking for the new building that will be ready about the same time as ours will be ready? I think in 19 or
2019 will be our 90th anniversary, and that's the goal.
Yeah, good goal.
Yeah.
Are you thinking of also expanding the historical narratives that you can tell and actually going into Latin America, Eastern Europe and so forth? Because of course, actually the way your predecessors during some periods collected makes you a pretty unique museum that can present both the core of the sort of well-known 20th century and 21st century art history, as well as the sort of new stories. And you can, of course, since you have the power as an institution, I mean, you have the power as an institution, you can actually rewrite history also. You can create new icons. There are masterpieces among these things in the basement, for sure.
Although it's also true, if what we show eventually turns out to have no meaning to people who look at them in future generations, just because they're at MoMA won't make them great. People will still be bored looking at them, and eventually just the curators will not be interested in showing them. So we don't have some kind of magic wand that we can wave and make something worthwhile just because we own it. But one of the important things that I think will be happening in the new building is looking at art that we have acquired in this very recent time, like say this decade, from places far away. And with a few exceptions, we didn't focus so much on that in the 20th century. And in the 21st century, we feel we must. That limiting ourselves to Europe and the Americas in this century feels like then we are not really talking, then we can't really call ourselves the Museum of Modern Art. So this is where we've, I think, made quite a dramatic change in a relatively short time. And we've only gone this far in looking at new work from places like here, but it's something that we're committed to.
Of course, I mean, this move from, what shall we call it, from international, which basically was the NATO alliance minus Denmark and Norway, I think, or something like that.
Yeah, and I don't know how many Danish artists we have.
Too global, of course, puts a totally new pressure on our teams in terms of their knowledge, their understanding of different cultures, different contexts, and so forth.
Yes.
And I mean, I think we'll hear in a while about Tate's way of addressing this, which is through their 7 or 8 committees, which of course also are linked to a fundraising aspect of it. And you've chosen another route, one can say, where you sort of more do it as a internal study process and deepening your knowledge internally. It's
Yeah.
a very different model.
Yeah, and it's our traditional model. I think next we have a couple of slides of shows that were at MoMA in the 50s and 60s when we had a newly established what we called international program. And our curators at that time visited places like, for example, India, and acquired work by artists such as Gaitande, or Japan, and did exhibitions of recent Japanese art in the mid-60s, and bought from those shows many, many works, such as this Tanaka. And that's the model that we've decided to continue. Well, then I should say during the later end of the 20th century, that model kind of slid into disuse. And in these past 10, 15 years, we've revived it. And we have learned a lot by hiring people with these expertises to be at the museum, and also by instituting a program of self-education in which we have kind of what you could say study groups of curators from different collections, different departments, who work together to travel to places like South America, like Asia, like Eastern Europe, and learn all we can, and then come back and apply that knowledge. And just to give you a quick example of what the study group from working on Asia, or from discussions with the people in that group, or just from our own initiative, the works we've acquired by Asian artists in the last 5 years include this very early Onkawara, these Yamaguchi sculptures, the Takamatsu slack of net, the Tetsumi Kudo sculpture from 72, 73, the Liu Fan painting from 74. So we're making, with these dates, I'm making the point that these were all things we didn't do at all then in this period. The He Gu Yang from a few years ago, the Yan Vo also. And these are all acquisitions which, in many, many cases, I think it's safe to say, came about in large part because your own, Dorian Chiang, was in the painting and sculpture department. And we felt like we could rely on his knowledge, his great fluency in many languages, his incredible travel schedule, which we never understood how he even could stay alive.
We don't either.
And, you know, this I think is super important, because one of the things that's most critical to us is that we are giving the same curatorial seriousness to art that, for example, we would buy from China or Japan as we would to art that is much more familiar to us. And I think what we've decided, at least for the moment, and we could change, is that by having people on the staff working within the institution at MoMA, that's the way that this institution can, at least to the best of our ability, gather that, that level of quality. It's that simple.
I'll see if I can put this, well, this is a crude way to put a rather complex question, but still. If you, I mean, how do you see, I mean, because you're, of course, you have ambitions, MoMA has ambitions to look at the world in a different way than it did 20 years ago, for example, 30 years ago, clearly. I mean, that's very clear. Do you see that mainly driven by the fact that we now know, thanks to dissemination of information, but also simply actual practice and the sort of globalization of the art, sort of the idea of art in a sense, that actually a lot of the important work is being made in places further away now than before? Or is it also trying to rectify something that was unfair, and that you're driven by that to give a more, well, we do agree that there are no true stories, of course, and no correct image, but still a more true story of what's happening in the world, because these are slightly different drivers. It might take you to different places.
Yeah. And I think it's true that the world has gotten smaller now. Like one of the things that we were talking about with this artist who happens to be on the screen, Jan Vo, what we say is that he was born in Vietnam, and then Lars made the joke yesterday, yeah, but he's really a Danish artist because he worked there a great deal. And of course, he's living in Europe now. He spent a great deal of time in New York. So it's not like I went to Vietnam and found somebody in some tiny village. No. You know, this is an international nomad. And nomad isn't even the right word because that makes him sound homeless, and he's at home everywhere, you know. But I think this kind of character, in so many ways, is characteristic. It's not the exception. Starting in the 90s, that artists begin in one place and then don't just simply move to some other place, but if they do that, continue going back and forth on a regular basis, or in fact have successive homes, or by working in this kind of biennial culture, make work in many different places. So it's not a decision that's isolated within the museum, it's a decision that's inevitable because we're reflecting the way the world works. And then once we do that, yeah, I think it forces us or invites us to ask the question, how did it used to be, right? Where it's not like the world had no exchange between continents before this century. So we're just asking new questions now, one of which is, what were those times and places of exchange in the 20th century that in fact served in many cases as inspiration to this current generation?
Now, of course, at the same time, MoMA has, from the outset, an international perspective. In a way, I was thinking about to what extent, I mean, we say that we look at the world from a Hong Kong, China, Asia perspective. You can see that we've sort of changing, we moved to another position. We look at the same story, or at least part of the same story, but we see it from a different perspective.
Thank
MoMA,
goodness.
in a way, is not really a New York perspective, truly. It's a little bit more complex than that. When I worked at Tate Modern, I would say, and I don't know if Frances agrees, I think she would, is that, I mean, it's so clear at Tate Modern that we look at the world from a London perspective because the root of the collection is really a museum of British art with international additions in a way. So it has such an obvious core. But MoMA is a little bit more complex there, or how would you say? Because you had this, I mean, Alfred Barr was really an internationalist.
Yes. He went and bought Malevich's and you know, other Russian artists within a few years of our opening, for example. But I would, however, say that we are a museum with a New York perspective. And no matter how much when we were in fact a monopoly as a museum of modern art 80 years ago, called ourselves the Museum of Modern Art with no need to say the New York Museum of Modern Art or anything like that. Nonetheless, from the beginning, you are who you are, and where you come from, you can't get away from. So absolutely, it was a New York perspective looking at Europe and elsewhere. And I would say, not at all in a negative way. We collect far more New York artists than any museum who isn't in New York should collect. You know, so even though New York doesn't maybe sound like a local community kind of place, it is. And we emphasize that in a way that we wouldn't if we were not located there, definitely. And there are definitely biases that we have in terms of what cities we look to that have to do with where we are located, right?
Right. And I think that right is the perfect conclusion. I agree.
Great.
And there will be, I mean, a further conversation later on with Dorian and between the three of you and also with the audience. So thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks.